And go ahead and get us started. And I'll just point out that for really, I guess it's maybe 6, 7 lectures now, we've been talking about inequality, the curse of wealth, why the 21st century economy is generating so much inequality, what that's doing to us, not just politically, but psychologically and in terms of our health, and what kind of approach we might take to addressing this if we are concerned about it. So that means, among other things, that we've taken perhaps a welcome break from the day to day of American politics, and I want to return us to that for a little bit, at least for today's session. And I'm going to do it in a particular way, and so I'm going to suggest that, as I've tried to suggest to you in the past. One way to think about this election is as between the two least popular candidates ever to compete for the presidency, and then a question of which of the liabilities of these two candidates is going to prove more decisive in the minds of the voters. And I think we can boil this down to a key division based on what we're seeing in the polls. And obviously, we are still more than half a year away from the actual election. And so it may not be the case that come November, what we're thinking about in March is what's on voters' minds. But what we can tell right now is that the number one liability for voters is, with regards to Joe Biden, his age, and with regards to Donald Trump, his alleged criminal conduct while in office before and since. And so in that way of framing things, which would you rather have? A person who you view as too old to meet the duties of the office, or a person who you view as likely to abuse the power that the office contains given their past conduct? And my suggestion is going to be to you today that that framing leaves a fair bit out. It captures, if you will, in a fairly superficial way, what voters are saying to pollsters, but it perhaps doesn't get at the deeper meaning or significance of age and criminality with regards to Biden and Trump. And so that's where I want to move. And I'm going to talk about what I see as the deeper significance of those issues, and then some issues to do with what many perceive to be a realignment in American politics and different ways to understand that realignment. So here we go. And by all means, as always, please feel free to ask your questions, raise your comments, express your disagreements as they arise, put them in the chat, or just unmute yourself and ask away. So the bottom line concern with Joe Biden is his age. At least that seems to be what we're seeing, right? And please note that Biden has as low an approval rating as any incumbent president at this point in his presidency, right? So 38% of people approve of the job he's doing, 56% disapprove. And there's something Maggie Haberman said the other day, which I find to be interesting, which is that the last time many Americans think they were doing all right was in the fall of 2019. And so the fall of 2019, we didn't have a international global pandemic that in the end killed millions of people, almost everyone touched by it in one way or another. And in the fall of 2019, we also didn't have inflation and its aftermath, higher prices for many of the commodities that many of us rely on. And so I do think that one of the things that at this point Biden owns and that accounts for his disapproval rating is 3 years in which many Americans feel that they're taken for granted, their normal, their decent way of life has been upended by perhaps, right, phenomena that have very little to do with Biden. At least with the case of the global pandemic, clearly it preceded Biden. But on the other hand, much of the worst of it was in his presidency. And not only that, I think we need to not pretend any more than we do with inflation that with the COVID-19 pandemic, the uh, worst effects are in the past, as opposed to that. And I see this more, I think, dealing with younger people, college age students. Many people feel their lives have been fundamentally disrupted, and especially if you're younger, um, if, say, the ages from 15 to 18 or 16 to 19, those are some of the most important years of your life. And if they have been fundamentally altered by a pandemic, that may leave you feeling uh, diminished, in some way traumatized. I don't particularly like that word. I think it's overused, but there are deep, lasting effects to what we've suffered the last few years from the pandemic. And then I would just note very quickly with regards to inflation, one of the things to note about inflation is that when it is brought under control, what that means is that it stops increasing prices, not that prices decrease. That's deflation, right? So the lack of inflation is not the same as deflation, and deflation is generally by itself a very worrisome economic phenomena. And so we don't want deflation, but the result is that our rents are higher, our groceries cost more, our gas prices are unstable, but often a fair bit higher than they were 3, 4 years ago. And so again, we're all feeling the aftermath of both the COVID pandemic and a period of sustained high inflation. And that despite the fact that both of those troubling events in our recent history appear to have been brought much better under control in the last year. And we will have to see whether Biden's approval rating ultimately goes up as people's and the data are very clear now. The wage growth is back ahead of inflation. It was behind inflation for the first 2 years of Biden's presidency, which means that the purchasing power for many Americans was being eroded. Now it's starting to grow again. Will Biden get a bump from that, or will people begin to feel like we finally turned the corner on the pandemic and maybe Biden will be less dragged down by the aftermath of the pandemic? But clearly, and please note that this poll, right, which is just one poll, but many polls seem to be showing this, that these polls are controversial. Do they actually capture where the electorate is? For instance, this is the Times Siena poll. It seems to show that women are evenly split between Trump and Biden. And given that Biden really trounced Trump with regards to women in 2020, and that in the intervening years, in fact, abortion seems to have become a more salient issue and maybe pushing more women in the direction of reticence for the GOP, and in particular for Trump, who appointed the justices to the court who overturned Roe v. Wade. Is that really reliable? But having said that, we do have this current snapshot, right, with 10% of the population still undecided, a substantial share of Republicans saying they'll never vote for Trump. So take this with a grain of salt. But it does seem, right, we look at the unfavorability rating, Trump is doing better than Biden, right? His favorability rating is about 5 points better, his unfavorability rating about 5 points less. Still, they're both very unpopular, but Trump less so than Biden. Trump apparently leading in the current polls. And here is the issue that many pollsters and talking heads are pointing to, and that is the age issue, right? Is Biden just too old to be an effective president. And nearly 50% of the people polled said they strongly agree with that. Another almost, well, a little bit more than 25%, so almost three quarters total, say that they somewhat agree. And by the way, it's only about 10% who strongly disagree. Now, please note that for Donald Trump, these numbers would be distressing, but for the comparison with Joe Biden, you add the strongly agree and somewhat agree together, and they don't even equal the strongly agree for Biden. And look at that, three times the number of people strongly disagree with that statement for Trump than for Biden. Now, having said all that, I'll just add very quickly that, and some of us may have paid a little bit of attention to the speech that Trump gave in Georgia a week ago today, and in that speech, at the top line news item, what's gotten a lot of attention is Trump mocking Biden's speech impediment, and the kind of classical bullying that Trump did in that event. But I think the more subtle point about that speech, or at least if you didn't just pay attention to the soundbite that the news led with, but paid attention to more of what Trump said in that speech, is, among other things, how rambling and unfocused and at points simply incoherent much of what Trump said was. And the question here, we have a bifurcated media system. Will any of the people who are potentially leaning in Trump's direction or on the fence in this election end up looking at Biden and Trump in a dispassionate way? Another thing that is more subtle in the news this week, the special prosecutor, was in front of Congress, but also his transcript of the interview with Biden, lightly redacted, was put in the public spotlight by congressional Democrats. And I have to say, you compare the way in which Biden comes across in those interviews, which he has memory lapses. There's no doubt about it. He has trouble with the year that his son died. He has some confusion between having left the Senate and having left the presidency. But the overwhelming, I think, impression of that transcript is that this is actually a man who has very good recall for many policy details, a real mastery of public policy issues. He may not be the most effective public communicator, but when you get down into the tall grass of policy issues, he clearly masters and recalls a lot of information. And so that's in that transcript. And on the other hand, you have Trump really just kind of rambling all over the place in his public appearances. How much, as the election comes into focus, does this discrepancy fade, right? Does Trump perhaps begin to look a little bit less capable? Does Biden start to look a little bit more capable? But having said all of that, I want to then really drill down on this issue. What do we mean when we, the polled public, say that we think Biden is too old to be an effective president? And here I think it's not really about the policy details that he has mastered. It is in part about the way in which he speaks, about the fact that he has a speech impediment. But I think more generally, you listen to the sound clip of Trump mocking Biden. There's an enthusiasm, there's a viciousness, there's an energy, there is a gusto to the way he speaks. He clearly relishes making fun of people, and he's very good at it. It riles up his crowds, and it makes him appear to be engaged and energetic. We saw Biden's State of the Union address and then his barnstorming appearances in various swing states. It appears that Biden is bringing a little bit more energy to the campaign season than perhaps he has to some of his public appearances during more formal occasions in his presidency. But there isn't that energy. There isn't that sometimes savage meanness to Biden. He definitely presents in a different way. And then Trump is very good, is so far at least, at managing his public appearances so that some of his incapacity doesn't show. And so again, I just think that this is uh, it may, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to advance the slides there, may be leveled out as the campaign season actually gets going. But Biden has an injury to his foot. Biden has some arthritic stiffness to his back. Biden, in the way that he moves, looks like a man somewhat diminished by age. Biden has also been working very hard for the last 3+ years, and perhaps that is shown in his lack of mobility and energy. All of that to say, I think this may be more about appearance, more about optics, more about style than it is about actual details of policy mastery, that is to say, about substance. And we have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that very often politics is more about style than substance. And Trump's style, as I've said before, brings a dark energy to his personality, animates him, energizes him in a way that Biden doesn't appear to be. But I also want to suggest, and this is where I will really focus attention, that age is, in a sense, representative or symbolic of something deeper. And I'm going to refer to this as capacity, but not capacity in the traditional cognitive or psychological sense, political capacity, and in particular, political capacity to make institutions that perhaps are lacking in capacity work by bending them to the will of the occupant of the office. And here, I think then the joke I've come up with is that we suffer from having a constitution that is over 230 years old. And many people look at Joe Biden and wonder whether he's older than the Constitution, right? The joke, I think I heard a laugh in the background, is meant to get at the one of the major criticisms, one of the major sources of democratic disaffection in the United States is the sense that our institutions do not work well on our behalf. And that a certain kind of energy, a certain kind of willfulness, perhaps a certain kind of ruthlessness or even disregard for the law is necessary to force those institutions to do our bidding, given all the inertia, given all the blockages that keep them from operating, given the way in which they've been captured by corporate interests and the hyper wealthy and political parties that are increasingly bought and sold by those vested interests. Trump comes across as someone who, as a billionaire, is independent of those interests, as someone who has consistently skirted or thwarted or violated the law, as perhaps someone who might not be as restrained. Whereas Biden comes across, and again, this is not about fairness. I think, in all fairness, given the razor thin majority that Joe Biden had in Congress for only 2 years, Biden has proved a very capable legislative president. Not surprising given his long background in the Senate. But having said all that, the impression is that Trump is more likely to be an effective president, given the diminished efficacy of the presidency and of American political institutions altogether. Please note, I think it's worthwhile noting that this disapproval rating that Biden is suffering from would have been disastrous or fatal uh, a generation or two ago in American politics. But what we see over the last three, four presidencies is that this just seems to be the effect of occupying this office. This office diminishes whoever occupies it because the office itself is hampered, and because, generally speaking, the president owns the things that Americans are unhappy about, and our government seems incapable of delivering on so much that we care about. So I'm not going to focus on the institutional incapacity of the presidency for a moment. I'm going to focus on the age issue. And here I just want to revisit some material that we've looked at before, but it's been a while. And so one of the questions is, what does it mean to be too old to be an effective president? And is there some magic number, right? Is Trump the right side of 80 and Biden the wrong side of 80 to be a good president? And here I'm going to return us to the work of Daniel Levitin, influential neuroscientist. He actually has an effect named after him, the Levitin effect, which has to do with the way in which musical memory seems to be much more resilient than other kinds of memory. Think about the way you remember old lyrics. Okay, so Anne has her hand up. I will stop for a second with the slides. Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm concerned that not only, I mean, the polling is has its own problems, but just in general, that the population through what goes on with social media is being told what to think way more than they did in the past.
Yeah.
And that what's being reflected now is not what people really think, but what they've been told to think.
Yeah, and so there's I think an important argument to be made that the age issue for Joe Biden is equivalent to the um, emails issue, the server issue for Hillary Clinton, right?
Yeah.
Mark Sullivan has made this argument very forcibly, and when she pointed out that if you looked at the electronic version of the New York Times the day after hers report came out, every article on the top half of the New York Times was about Biden's age, right? And by the way, the New York Times is no fan of Donald Trump, right? Just think about what Fox News is doing. So yes, that in a sense this is a distraction. This is a media-fed story. I'll just say briefly, I got back from the airport very late last night. I took an Uber home. My cab driver was from India, seemed not to be very well informed about American politics. I actually asked him about Indian politics. There's an election forthcoming, and I wanted to know what he thought about Modi. But he very quickly pivoted to the American election, and he immediately said Biden's just too old. And so I do think we have to recognize that on the one hand, the media are feeding this story. Some of them because they're partisan, some of them because they're commercial, and this story sells. Some of it sells because so many Democrats are so frightened that Trump is going to win the next election and so worried that Biden is not a competitive enough candidate, right? So there are multiple forces that lead the media to focus on this issue, but we're focused on it as well. We, the American people. I don't believe that this is all a media generated phenomenon. And so Having said that, it's often a chicken and egg problem, right? Do we pay attention to what the media broadcasts? Do the media simply broadcast what we're already thinking about? But having said that, I don't think we can view this as a media manufactured concern. I do think it's a real concern, and part of what I'm trying to get at is the way in which seeing it as a concern about Biden's age is to miss what's really driving this. What's really driving this is a concern about the efficacy of whoever occupies that office and whether or not it is the case that Trump will be a more effective, energetic, willful, ruthless president. And those attributes, by the way, are independent of his policies, right? It's just, will he bend this creaky old dysfunctional office in a way that'll make it a little bit more um, able to deliver the goods in the 21st century in America? So I appreciate the question. I appreciate the concern. I don't entirely agree that it's media driven. I do share the concern that the media are amplifying a false concern. But having
Yeah.
said that, in part, I'm also suggesting that the real concern is not the age. The real concern is that Biden is too traditional a politician, too law abiding, too committed to compromise and bipartisanship and traditional political virtues to do what needs to be done to make the government work for the people in the 21st century. That's a very
Mhm.
sympathetic reading, and I'm in part I'm trying to do this to suggest that there's a deeper underlying concern or feeling structure that's motivating the focus on his age. Having said that, obviously the policy stuff matters. And the idea that what Trump is going to do, apparently on his first day in office, is be dictator for a day or authoritarian for a day and try to round up every suspected person who is undocumented in the country. That should matter to us too. And by the way, that is part of Trump's popularity as well. So it's hard to pull these things apart. Although for the moment, I'm really trying to focus on why people are thinking so much about Biden's age. Thank you for the good comment, Ann. Anybody else while I'm out of the slides, or should I jump back in? Okay, I'm going to jump back in then. Give me just a moment. So I was starting to speak with you about Daniel Levitin and the cognitive science of aging, such as we understand it now. And I'll just point out very quickly, this is a leading neuroscientist, and I've spoken with you before about his book, Successful Aging. The question it raises is how much is the stereotype about aging accurate? And how much does it distort what neuroscience teaches us about what goes on in the brain as we age? And Levitin's clear takeaway is that the stereotype is highly distorted and what goes on is much more complicated, much more subtle, and in many ways much more hopeful than the stereotype suggests. So the first, and I think the fundamental thing that Levitin, and he's building on a whole body of recent scholarship, including Eric Kandel's work, for which he won a Nobel Prize, the work suggests that learning, developing, the technical term here is neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to form new neural connections, new neural pathways, to thereby create new memories and new kinds of knowledge, persists throughout life. That there are 80, 90 people who are 100 years old who are still learning new things every day. And by the way, that keeping your brain active, probably not through doing Sudoku, but by learning new things, whether that's a new language or dancing or a new game or acquainting yourself with new art or new literature, that's really important to maintaining that capacity for learning. And then additionally, that lifetime experience and environmental factors may be as important as genetics in determining the way that we age. Do we uh, have life that requires new activity, new engagement out of us, even as we grow older? Do we have experiences? And here I'm going to point to something specific in Biden for a moment, and that is the fact that he seems to have gotten Putin right long before many of Putin's European neighbors did. That Biden was the one sounding the alarm. Part of this is American intelligence may have been better, but I think part of it is that Biden recognized the fundamental character of Vladimir Putin and its political implications, and therefore recognized that the mounting of troops on the border of the Ukraine was not a feint or a show, but in fact preparatory to an invasion, and that he has been very successful in managing the NATO and European and global response to Putin's aggression until he got handicapped by domestic politics, by the strangulation of Ukraine aid in the House of Representatives. And that we'll have to see whether the House ultimately overcomes its partisan blockade on Ukraine aid, and whether or not the fundamental, I guess what I would see as one of the most important accomplishments of Biden's foreign policy gets undercut by domestic politics. But having said that, I think that the fact that this is a man who had been on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate for a couple decades, had been a lifelong student of international affairs, that this is an environmental factor that allows him to, in his 80s, still be a very effective leader. In addition to that, right, your personality. Are you an active person? Are you the type of person who fears or who relishes the aging process? The importance of culture. Do you live in a society with age stereotypes? And here I'm just going to pause for a second to ask you to envision the scenario in which Joe Biden wins the presidency in 2024, in which he is able to serve out his full term or most of it, in which he proves to be quite capable. Perhaps at some point the Democrats retake control of both houses of Congress and Biden is able to get more legislation through, that he ends his presidency as an apparently successful and more popular president than he is today, whether in fact that might alter Americans' cultural understandings about aging, right? And one of the things that work like Levitin's does is to contrast Japan or China, societies that esteem their elders and see them as wise and more capable, whether perhaps we might move a little bit in that direction. Final factor is whether, if you are the kind of person who has uh, valued the vitality of youth in your youth, you're able to change your personality to find active engagement and value in the later phases of life. That also matters. I would add, and with the Her report, one of the things that we're looking at is, in particular, Biden's memory, right? And he got confused about whether he had left the vice presidency or the Senate in 2017, when exactly his son had died. He clearly struggled to remember some things. Much else in that interview seems to indicate that he's got a very sharp memory for a lot of policy issues. And given what neuroscience teaches about memory, that it's not one thing, that there are in fact three fundamental kinds of memory. And in particular for long-term memory, which is the one that sometimes fades somewhat with aging, there are different aspects of it, perhaps all told maybe five or six discrete aspects of long-term memory. And it's not just that we differentiate different kinds of memory, they're actually rooted in differential evolved neurocognitive systems located in different regions in the brain, relying on different brain substructures. And so the idea that memory declines with age is not just a simplification, it's a mistake, because aspects of memory decline. Short term memory may become a little bit less strong. Some aspects of episodic or semantic memory may fade, but other aspects of memory actually grow stronger with age. And so again, having a more subtle, more accurate view may help us to see that the stereotype that Biden is saddled with is, in as most stereotypes are, inaccurate and distortive. And then to think through, why is it nevertheless um, seeming to influence many people's views of the president? And I think that's because it's really getting at something other than his age or the corollary incapacities that come with age. Finally, very quickly, noting that intelligence, also like memory, is not a single thing or process, cognitively speaking, that in fact there are probably 10 different kinds of intelligence, each of them rooted in different cognitive aspects of the structure of the brain, and that the result is that different kinds of intelligence may decline or increase or change with aging, but it's certainly not the case that we can speak of a uniform decline in either memory or intelligence. As a matter of fact, just like with memory, aspects of intelligence improve as we age. So, with all of that in mind, my first suggestion, right, is that the issue of Biden's age is, in fact, a stand in um, for a different issue that is really motivating people to be concerned about his age, which is whether or not he can continue to be an effective president, whether he has been an effective president, whether when faced with the choice between Trump and Biden, Trump has attributes that might allow him to be more effective as a president. That's, it seems to me, the real issue. So now turning to Trump and the question of his indictments and criminality before, while, and after being president. And in particular, the question of whether or not we should trust someone who has shown so little respect for the law, such a pronounced willingness to violate it, to occupy an office that concentrates so much power, and especially when he is indicating in advance that he wants to abuse the power that that office contains to prosecute or persecute his perceived enemies, whether that's Joe Biden and the Biden family, or migrants, or racial minorities, or Democrats, or his enemy list within the Republican Party. And so, how much will the likely criminal trials of the next 6 months focus public opinion in ways that will damage Donald Trump by calling to our attention the fact that he is not to be trusted with the power vested in the office, that if he is in the office again, he will likely be worse a second time round. He will have figured out better how to surround himself with enablers as opposed to the so called adults in the room of his first presidential administration, who in many ways restrained his worst tendencies for lawlessness. Now, the diagrams on the board, I have to admit, I used an old slide, are not entirely accurate. It does appear now that the first case likely to go before a judge and a jury is the Manhattan criminal case, that will probably not go to trial until next month. April 22nd, I believe, is the date that we currently have. And the other cases are all indefinite in their time frame. Obviously, there was some major developments in the Georgia case last week, including Fani Willis being allowed to continue to serve as the district attorney prosecuting the case, but only on the condition that the special prosecutor that she appointed and also had an affair with I'm sorry, had a relationship with, is no longer on the case, and he has resigned. The Manhattan case is delayed in part because a new trove of documents was shared with Trump and his legal team, and Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan district attorney, wants to give them time to prepare. By the way, 6 of the counts against the well, Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani were dismissed on appeal by a judge in Georgia last week. That includes the count related to Trump's phone call with Brad Raffensperger, in which he asked Raffensperger to, quote, find the number of votes needed to overturn the outcome of the Georgia election. Now, having said all of that, please note that Fani Willis can appeal, or she can recraft those indictments. The issue was that the indictments were too vague to allow Trump to effectively defend himself. And so it doesn't mean that they'll completely go away. But if those indictments have to be redrawn and specified, that will further delay that case. The January 6th federal case, which it seems to me is perhaps the most important of these cases, only 4 counts, so very cleanly drawn. Trump is the only defendant, and the special prosecutor, Jack Smith, does not have the baggage that Fani Willis is currently dragging. That is indefinitely delayed until the Supreme Court hears the appeal on the immunity issue. And so we don't know when this trial will occur, but it's entirely possible that it could occur in the fall, right? Which in a sense would be terribly damaging to Trump in 2 senses. The first is, as a criminal defendant, he will have to be in the courtroom when he should be, as a presidential candidate, campaigning. And one of the questions is whether the judge in that case might see a value to allowing Trump to campaign and might delay the trial until after the election, which is a really complex issue in terms of which values the judge should weigh in terms of the timing of the trial. Is the information that is going to come out from the trial valuable in a way that requires that it come out before the election? How do you weigh those considerations? Really tangled, really interesting, entirely unprecedented legal questions that are hard to predict how they will be resolved. But first, the Supreme Court has to say whether or not Trump as president is immune from prosecution for everything he did as president. And then there's finally the classified documents case with Judge Eileen Cannon in charge of that case. And I think most people are skeptical of the idea that that case would come to trial. This is another federal case with Jack Smith in charge, but a Trump appointed judge who appears to be more sympathetic to Trump and perhaps more willing to allow him to delay. Now, having said all of that, that's just the background. The issue I want to pull into the foreground is the question of whether or not we should be so certain that these cases will damage Trump. And here I want to suggest we have to answer that question with some nuance, depending upon who we're talking about. And so there's some polling data that suburban women who might otherwise vote for Trump are troubled by his alleged criminality. And the more the details of these cases get brought into the public spotlight, as was done by the congressional inquiry into the January 6th invasion of Congress, that dragged Trump's approval rating down, dragged his support down. Will a trial do the same with those critical voters? But I want to suggest, and this is again, I think the deeper subtext to these issues, that for Trump, some of his supporters actually view his lawlessness and his prosecution as assets, not as liabilities. So let me unpack that for a second. First, in terms of his prosecution, Trump says that he is being persecuted because he stands up for his supporters, and that this is the deep state trying to take down anyone who stands up for the people who are currently neglected within the American political system. And this idea that the advocacy, the way in which Trump represents those who have been neglected by the political elite for the last 50 years, that's given greater credibility by his persecution. That may generate greater enthusiasm for Trump uh, from his core voters, those who are particularly attracted to his politics of grievance and the kind of messianic role he claims to play as finally standing up for the people who are neglected in American politics. And then we add a second dimension to this, which is, as we will see, a large number of Americans have soured on the kind of liberal constitutional democracy that the framers of our Constitution bequeathed us, and that we have, over the course of centuries, remade, but nevertheless maintained core aspects of the institutional infrastructure, separation of powers, uh, the checks and balances system, the idea of the rule of law, and that for many voters, this represents a kind of procedural limitation on the strength and efficacy they want from their political institutions. And so I hope you maybe see the way these two claims dovetail, right? The political system is rigged. It doesn't work for you anymore. I will stand up for you, and therefore you will find me persecuted by my enemies, by the deep state, by the rigged system. But don't be confused. That's all just because they don't want me to work on your behalf. And by the way, to work on your behalf, I can't continue to adhere to these institutional niceties, things like the Constitution and the rule of law. I need to, in part because the deep state is coming after me, in part because it's the only way to make this creaky old system work, not be restrained by institutional procedural niceties. I need to break the law in order to be an effective politician for you. And so again, to recognize that for those of us who are frightened of a second Trump presidency and aghast at the way in which he abused the powers in the presidency in his first term, deeply concerned that he will be all the more effective in a second term, we are inclined to view all of these indictments, all of these counts, all of the conduct that give rise to them as simply reprehensible. But for many Americans, this is not a liability. This is, in fact, a strength. So again, a deeper subtext. And then, by the way, you bring Biden and Trump together, a traditional liberal Democrat willing to engage in bipartisanship, but also only using the power in his office in the way in which it is restrained by the rule of law, as opposed to this energetic, willful, admittedly sometimes illegal, but nevertheless working on our behalf man. And you see in which these two issues, if you will, complement each other in the eyes of a Trump supporter, a Biden critic. So having said all of that, this then leads to maybe a little bit greater clarity about what's going on in the swing states, and about the fact that it does appear that Trump is leading in many of the battleground states. That this is a peculiar election with neither candidate having a strong favorable view, especially in the battleground states, and 20% of the electorate being unfavorable of both. We see Joe Biden apparently losing some of his support from the groups that traditionally support him. And that's young people, that's racial minorities, that's more educated people. We see a lot of this apparently coming from or being driven by what inflation has done to people's purchasing powers under the Biden presidency, the sense that Trump is regarded as a better economic president by every group in these polls. But let me now focus for a second on some new information, very recently published material that I think is important. And I'm going to conclude the lecture today by talking a little bit about some of the deeper realignments occurring in American politics. One of the things to see, and the diagram on the left helps us to look at this economically, the diagram on the right to look at it geographically, is that there is a shift in the American electorate. And so we start with 2012, right? And we see that the Democrats got a large share of poor voters, right? And that has come down in the intervening years. And if we look at 2012 and compare, right, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, in each of those 4-year cycles, the share of wealthy Americans voting for Democrats has gone up. And by the way, as is so often the case, wealth and education coincide in this diagram. And so this is often called a U-shaped curve, and it's becoming, if you will, more of a U, in the sense that the people in the middle are not supporting the Democrats. This is essentially relatively poor urban dwellers and relatively wealthy suburban dwellers, whereas ex-urban and rural people who are in the middle are not voting for the Democrats. And then this comes out in the geographic swings that have occurred in the big title elections, 2010 and 2018, 2010, when the House swung radically for the Republicans, 2018, when it swung back for the Democrats. And what this diagram shows is the big gains by the Republicans in 2010 occurred in the purely rural or the rural suburban mixed areas, whereas the big gains for the Democrats occurred in the dense suburban and sparse suburban areas. And I'm just pointing out to you, this is a realignment that is roiling American politics that underlies part of the opinion formation dynamics I've been talking about so far. And it is for the Democrats hard to build this coalition, right, in which you have the poorest and the most affluent uh, coming together as a coalition. And in particular, what seems to be necessary to build this coalition is repelling the middle and the rural suburban voters. One last issue I think to pay attention to for today, and that's what abortion is doing to our politics. And again, this is a new change, right? Of course, Roe v. Wade was overturned only a couple years ago in the Dobbs decision. And what we see is that decision is deeply unpopular. Please note that 2/3 of Americans support a federal right to abortion, 3/4 of women under the age of 50, and please note that 43% of Republicans support a constitutional right or federal degree to protection of the right to abortion. Now, let me drill down on this for a second and note the very high numbers, even in Republicans, that support protection when there are pregnancy related medical emergencies. But also note the very high support for uh, abortion among women who are Democrats. And one of the things I want to note is that 1 in 5, 20% of the women who said abortion is the most important issue for me, right? And that represents 12% of total voters, right? And the majority of them are now pro-choice, not pro-life, also said they didn't vote in the 2020 election, but they are motivated by this issue to vote in the 2024 election. One more thing to note, right? That the way in which abortion has remained available and I believe it's about 17 states now that have passed bans or restrictions, a lot of it has to do with the availability of abortifacient pills, abortion pills. And in particular, laws passed in 7 states that are called telemedicine abortion shield laws that basically say a doctor in Massachusetts can prescribe an abortion pill or pills for women in Texas, and that Texas cannot prosecute them, that Massachusetts will shield them from prosecution. And you add to that then the fact that the Supreme Court is currently going to decide an issue related to the availability of one of the most important abortion pills, mifepristone. And the issue here is, should, as the appellate court did, the FDA return to the pre-2016 regulation of this pill, which requires that you see the doctor prescribing the pill in person 3 times, which of course will make telemedicine prescription impossible, right? And so um, one outcome would be the Supreme Court sides with the appellate court, and all of a sudden, abortion is much less available in many states in the United States, or else the Supreme Court sides with the Justice Department and the FDA and upholds the current regulations, in which case abortion is still available, but the fragility of the protection of abortion, the political dependency of it in a post-Roe world may still be very much on many people, especially women's minds, in the build up to this decision, which should be this June. So, again, another really important shifting dynamic in American politics that perhaps is beneath the surface of the age and indictment discourse surrounding Biden and Trump. I'll stop there. Happy to take whatever questions you have. Who wants to start us out? Comments, disagreements? Flossie, go ahead. Unmute yourself, please. Yeah, not yet. There you
David,
Yes.
what do you make of Justice Cannon? She is rather interesting. I cannot see her as other than a very canny person. She is playing both sides. If I could unpack her, I have a clearer view of where we stand. I'd like to hear your opinion.
Yeah, I am not steeped in her biography, and I'm not sure how much that would allow me to understand her better than I do. So I'm going to speak in rather general terms. I'm going to point out by noting something that came out of the conservative reaction to H.W. Bush's appointment of Stephen Breyer to the court, which is this slogan, no more Breyers, right? Breyer was appointed. They thought they had the vote to overturn Roe, and lo and behold, once he got in the court, he turned out to be more moderate than they realized he was going to be at the time they appointed and confirmed him. So no more Breyers meant make sure that the justice you appoint really is going to do what you appointed them to do. And of course, Cannon was one of the votes to overturn Roe v. Wade. And so we can't forget that, and has generally been quite conservative in much of her voting, and not just conservative, quite originalist. And we know that her religious values are also very conservative, and that she is someone who believes that the Constitution should be read, at least in part, in light of conservative Christian religious values. Having said all of that, I suspect, Flossie, you're thinking about her position in the Trump v. Anderson case, in which, as I've shared with you, I think the Supreme Court made a fundamental mistake, and there's been recent writing on this, but that the 5 justice majority opinion that said the third section of the 14th Amendment cannot be enforced unless via an act of Congress seems to fly in the face of what the 14th Amendment, Article 3 says, and of what its function was supposed to be. And Cannon indicated in a concurrent opinion, while she agreed that Colorado should not be able to bar Trump from the ballot on its own, did not agree that the Supreme Court was appropriate in requiring Congress to act before the third section of the 14th Amendment could be enforced. So that's interesting. I think it does indicate that she's not simply in lockstep with the other conservative justices, that there's a kind of institutional thinking and some independence being exercised on her part, and that she is concerned that the Supreme Court is suffering because it's increasingly perceived as another partisan institution, and that justices should do their best when they can to avoid appearing to be purely partisan. So yes, I'm not sure whether I call her canny or subtle. There is a history, right? And Sandra Day O'Connor might be someone we would point to. Breyer would be another person we could point to, of justices, once they're on the court, evolving, changing, right? The insulation of being on the court allows them the time, the institutional role that they're playing as the highest interpreter of the Constitution brings out different ideas and sensibilities in them. It might be interesting to have this conversation 5 or 10 years from now to see whether the lack of complete agreement with the majority in Trump v. Anderson is a one-off departure or the beginning of the move in the direction of greater independence on Cannon on her part. We'll have to wait and see. And by the way, I think I repeated what you said. You're referring to Amy Coney Barrett, I believe. Is that correct? That yeah, and if so, everything I just said applies. If you were referring to the judge in the Trump case, with apologies, I answered a totally different question. Flossie?
She asked about Cannon.
Yeah, and I interpreted her to be asking about Coney Barrett. I apologize. Who were you? Flossie, unmute yourself for a second. There you go.
Interested in the possibility that Cannon, the
Oh,
one who was delaying the procedure, is
right.
aiming for a position in to get into the Supreme Court.
I am so sorry. I misinterpreted your question. So, I Cannon again. I think a different answer entirely is in order. Then, calling her canny, calling her. I'll be direct, underqualified. You know, and so she's a Trump, a last minute Trump appointment, and appears to be part of the effort during the Trump presidency to appoint as many conservative members to the federal bench as possible, not just to the Supreme Court, but to all levels of the federal bench. And some point, maybe we'll talk about the Fifth Circuit, which has now a majority conservative and seems to be going in some very peculiar directions. That includes the mifepristone decision, but yes, I don't know what to make of her. Obviously, she's under a great deal of scrutiny. She just rejected one of Trump's efforts to have the case against him in terms of the retention of the documents dismissed. But having said that, as I said earlier, it appears to me that she's doing nothing to expedite the case and has in the past shown peculiar, if not undue, deference to the former president. So I worried that that would still be the case. I apologize for misconstruing your question. You heard a lot about Coney Barrett when you were asking about Cannon, with apologies. Did I see somebody else with their hand up? All right, I did, but maybe that question has passed. I'm just looking through, yeah, or maybe it was a inadvertent hand. Anybody else with any comments
I
for
was
today?
asking that question.
Oh, hi, Bill. Go ahead.
No, you answered the question now. I was going to ask you, since when did Carol get appointed to the Supreme Court?
Yes, no, my mistake.
Played up now. Okay.
Thank you, Bill. All right. So I think that's a good place to end. Pleasure, as always, being with you. I hope I hope it's a good week for all of you. I look forward to seeing you next Saturday. And by the way, the little preview I gave you about abortion today, that's where I want to go in the coming weeks to think more systematically. It is Women's History Month, among other things, about how the politics of gender and sexuality may influence what's happening in 2024. Be well, everyone. See you all next week. Thanks for being with me today. Bye-bye.